The paper feels like ice in my hand, thin and sharp, each typed word a tiny, frozen dagger. An official-looking stamp, a dense, bureaucratic blue, sits arrogantly at the top. Eviction Notice. The words blur, then sharpen with a cruel clarity. My breath catches, a stalled engine in my chest. Below the sterile, impersonal language, there's a signature. Mark's signature. My husband. Or, I suppose, my soon-to-be ex-husband. It's a flourish of ink I know as well as my own name, a signature I've seen on birthday cards, on mortgage documents for this very house, on silly love notes left on the refrigerator. Now, it's a weapon, severing me from my home, my life, my sense of safety. My gaze drifts from the offensive document to the window, to the garden I painstakingly nurtured, rose bushes just beginning to show their tight, promising buds. Our garden, or so I thought. The silence in the kitchen, usually a comforting hum of refrigerator and distant traffic, is suddenly immense, a vacuum sucking all the warmth from the room. I can hear the frantic thumping of my own heart, a trapped bird against my ribs. This isn't happening. This can't be happening. But the paper in my hand is undeniably real, cold and unyielding. Eviction. From my home. By his hand. If you've ever felt the floor drop out from under you, just completely vanish, let me know in the comments. I read every single one. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. It helps me share these stories, these pieces of life, more than you can imagine. Just a few months ago, this kitchen was the heart of our world. Sunlight would pour through that same window, painting stripes across the worn oak table where Mark would sit, hunched over his laptop, a perpetually furrowed brow that I used to find endearing. I'd make coffee, the aroma mingling with the scent of toast, or sometimes, on weekends, cinnamon rolls, his favorite. He'd reach out, without looking up, and his hand would find mine, a brief, warm squeeze. A silent acknowledgement. We're here. Together. That's what I believed. This house, a sprawling old Victorian with a slightly crooked porch and drafty windows, wasn't just a structure of wood and plaster. It was a testament. We'd found it by accident, a forgotten listing, overgrown and dilapidated. But it had good bones, Mark said, his eyes shining with a vision I eagerly shared. We poured our weekends, our savings, our arguments, and our laughter into its restoration. Every loose floorboard we secured, every wall we painted, every antique doorknob we polished felt like another brick in the foundation of our life together. I remember the day we finally moved in, surrounded by teetering boxes and the smell of fresh paint. We ordered pizza, ate it sitting on the bare floor of the living room, using a roll of wallpaper as a makeshift table. Mark raised a greasy slice. To our forever home, he toasted, his voice thick with emotion, or maybe just exhaustion. I'd clinked my slice against his, my heart so full it felt like it might spill over. Forever. A word I'd clung to, a promise I'd enshrined. The slightly faded floral wallpaper in the hallway? I'd spent weeks agonizing over that choice, Mark patiently, or so I thought, holding up sample after sample. The scratch on the newel post at the bottom of the stairs? That was from wrestling the oversized armchair, his reading chair, into the living room. It was a dark green velvet, already worn in patches when we bought it from a dusty antique shop. He'd spend hours in it, lost in books, while I curled up on the sofa nearby, the quiet companionship a warm blanket. The kitchen counter, a cool expanse of granite we'd splurged on, bore the faint stains of countless meals prepared, wine spilled, conversations that lasted late into the night. We'd lean there, hips touching, dissecting our days, planning futures that now feel like elaborate, cruel fictions. Even the slightly crooked picture frame in the upstairs landing, a photo of us on a windswept beach in Maine, grinning like fools, a picture we always meant to straighten but never did. It was part of the tapestry. These weren't just things, objects, decor. They were markers. They were us. Or, more accurately, they were the us I believed in with every fiber of my being. There were subtle shifts, of course, tiny tremors I dismissed as the natural settling of a long-term relationship. Mark grew quieter, more preoccupied with work. The late-night talks became less frequent, his hand on mine less automatic. He started traveling more for his job, or so he said. Sometimes, I'd catch a strange, calculating look in his eyes when he thought I wasn't watching, a flicker of something I couldn't name, something that made a tiny knot of unease tighten in my stomach. But I'd push it away. We were Mark and Sarah. Solid. Enduring. We had history. We had this house. What could possibly go wrong? I see now that I was looking at a carefully curated performance, while the real script was being written in secret, in a language I didn't understand. I was living in our dream, while he was apparently drafting its demolition. The love, the shared history, the home we built, I thought these were anchors. It turns out, for him, they were just ballast to be jettisoned. It came on a Tuesday. Tuesdays were supposed to be mundane, a day for catching up on laundry, maybe a trip to the grocery store, the gentle rhythm of a life comfortably lived. Instead, a sleek black car I didn't recognize pulled up to the curb. A man in a sharp suit, carrying a crisp manila envelope, strode purposefully up our garden path, his polished shoes clicking on the flagstones I'd helped lay. My heart gave a little flutter of something. Not quite fear, more like a startled bird. I opened the door before he could ring the bell. He didn't smile, just asked, "Sarah Clark?" "Yes." He handed me the envelope. "You've been served." Served? Like in a restaurant? The word felt alien. He turned and walked away, clinical, detached, leaving me standing in the doorway with this thick, strangely heavy package in my hand. The air suddenly felt cold. I remember the scent of Mrs. Henderson's roses from next door, usually a comfort, now somehow cloying, funereal. Back in the kitchen, the same kitchen that held so many warm memories, I sat down at the oak table. My hands trembled as I tore open the envelope. Legal documents. Pages and pages of them. Dense, impenetrable paragraphs. But certain words leaped out, stark and brutal. Dissolution of marriage. Petitioner, Mark Clark. Respondent, Sarah Clark. And then, the phrase that punched the air from my lungs. Irreconcilable differences. Irreconcilable. Such a sterile, legalistic word for the shattering of a world. My world. Mark wanted a divorce. My husband, the man who'd toasted to our forever home, the man whose hand I'd held through sickness and celebration, the man I thought knew my soul, wanted to dismantle everything we were, everything we'd built. The silence in the house pressed in, suffocating. I couldn't breathe. I read the words again and again, hoping they would change, rearrange themselves into something less horrifying. But they remained, fixed and immutable, irreconcilable. It was a pronouncement, a judgment. He hadn't spoken to me. No tearful confession, no anguished discussion. No, we need to talk, just this. A cold, formal declaration delivered by a stranger. My first thought, absurdly, was, but I just bought his favorite coffee beans yesterday. Then, a wave of nausea, so profound I had to grip the edge of the table. This couldn't be real. It felt like a scene from a movie, a badly written one. People didn't just do this. Not Mark. Not our marriage. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers clumsy, stabbing at the screen. I called him. Straight to voicemail. "Mark, it's me. I got the papers." "What is this?" "Mark, please call me. We need to talk." My voice sounded thin, reedy, like a stranger's. I tried again. Voicemail. And again. Voicemail. The man who had promised to love and cherish me, who had vowed to stand by me, was suddenly a ghost, a phantom accessible only through a disembodied, recorded greeting. The lack of explanation, the sheer, brutal efficiency of it, was perhaps the cruelest part. It was an erasure. As if 15 years of shared life could be expunged with a signature and a courier. The house, our beautiful, painstakingly restored house, suddenly felt alien. A stage set for a play whose happy ending had been violently rewritten. The walls seemed to be closing in, the memories they held now tainted, each one a fresh stab of pain. Irreconcilable. The word echoed in the sudden, Vast emptiness of my life. My first instinct, even through the fog of shock and betrayal, was to fix it, to understand, to talk. Surely, there was a mistake, a monstrous misunderstanding. Mark, the Mark I knew, or thought I knew, wouldn't do this. Not like this. I replayed our last few weeks, months, searching for clues, for warnings I must have missed. Were his longer hours at work not about work at all? Were his distracted silences not preoccupation, but detachment? The little omissions, the subtle evasions, had they been signposts on a road I was too blind to see? His calls continued to go straight to voicemail, each automated greeting a tiny, fresh insult. Texts remained unread, 2 blue ticks of confirmation that he'd received them, followed by an abyss of silence. The silence was louder, more damning, than any argument we'd ever had. It was a deliberate, calculated wall, and I was on the outside, frantically beating against it. I paced the house, our house, his reading chair a silent rebuke in the corner, the kitchen counter cold beneath my palms. Each object, once a source of comfort, now a repository of pain. The photographs on the mantelpiece, us smiling on holidays, at weddings, at family gatherings, seemed to mock me. Were all those smiles lies? Was I the only one who believed in the narrative they told? Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. The nights were endless stretches of darkness, punctuated by the frantic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, another piece we'd lovingly restored together, its chimes now sounding like a mournful countdown. I'd lie in our bed, the space beside me achingly empty, and stare at the ceiling, my mind a relentless carousel of questions, of memories, of a future that had just been stolen. Friends were complicated. Some called, their voices laced with pity or an uncomfortable curiosity. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. Is there anything I can do?" But what could they do? Could they rewind time? Could they make Mark talk to me? A few, closer to Mark, grew distant, their calls less frequent, their excuses for not meeting up flimsy and transparent. It was a subtle, painful culling of the social herd. I was becoming an uncomfortable reminder of something broken. I made an appointment with a lawyer, a woman named Ms. Albright, recommended by a colleague. Her office was stark, modern, a counterpoint to the warm, lived-in chaos of my home. She was kind but direct, her gaze unflinching as I stumbled through my story, the divorce papers clutched in my hand like a shield. She explained the legal process, the division of assets, the concept of a no-fault divorce state, which meant Mark didn't even need a reason beyond irreconcilable differences assets. Such a cold word for the life we'd built. The house, I'd said, my voice barely a whisper. What about the house? It was our biggest asset, the repository of so much of our shared capital, both financial and emotional. Ms. Albright had pursed her lips. Marital property is typically divided. We'll need to see the deed, mortgage statements, proof of contributions from both parties. Contributions. I'd contributed years of my life, my love, my unpaid labor in creating and maintaining that home. How do you quantify that on a balance sheet? The dawning realization of how messy, how brutal this was going to be, settled over me like a shroud. This wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was a battle. And Mark, it seemed, had fired the first shot without any warning. The man I had loved was now my adversary, a stranger with a chillingly effective plan to dismantle not just our union, but my very sense of self. The floorboards I walked on, the walls that surrounded me, no longer felt like mine. They felt like contested territory. And I was woefully unprepared for the war that was clearly coming. Then, just as I was beginning to navigate the initial shockwaves of the divorce filing, trying to find some semblance of footing on a ground that constantly shifted beneath me, the second envelope arrived. This one wasn't hand-delivered by a suited stranger. It came with the regular mail, tucked innocuously between a seed catalog and a bill. But the official-looking window and the legal return address made my stomach clench. I remember standing in the hallway, the scent of lemon polish from my earlier, desperate attempt at normalcy still lingering in the air, and feeling a profound sense of dread. It was the eviction notice. If the divorce papers were a punch to the gut, this was a deliberate, calculated twist of the knife in an already bleeding wound. Not just divorce, but displacement, erasure. He was systematically dismantling our life, and I was the primary collateral damage. The legal jargon swam before my eyes. Notice to vacate. Unlawful detainer. Premises. Our home, reduced to a cold, legal term. His signature, again, bold and unapologetic at the bottom. My hands shook so violently, I could barely hold the paper. He wanted me out. Out of the house we'd chosen together, renovated together, lived in together for over a decade. The sheer audacity, the cruelty of it, was breathtaking. How could he? Did he have the right? Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the numbness. I immediately called Miss Albright. Her calm, professional voice was a lifeline in the swirling chaos of my emotions. An eviction notice? While divorce proceedings are pending regarding the marital home. That's digressive, Sarah. Even her practiced composure seemed momentarily ruffled. We need to see that document immediately. Fax it or scan it over. The legal battle, which had seemed like a distant, abstract threat, suddenly became terrifyingly real and immediate. It wasn't just about dividing assets anymore. It was about whether I'd have a roof over my head. Mark, it appeared, was not content with simply ending our marriage. He wanted to obliterate my connection to our shared past, to render me homeless and vulnerable. The next few weeks were a blur of frantic phone calls, document gathering, and sleepless nights spent staring at the ceiling, imagining bailiffs at the door. Mark, true to his new form, remained a phantom. He communicated only through his lawyer, a man whose letters were as cold and ruthless as Mark's actions. They claimed Mark had made significantly larger financial contributions to the property, that his name was primarily on certain initial documents, conveniently ignoring my subsequent contributions and the years of shared life and investment, and that, as the primary earner, he had a greater claim. They were painting a picture of me as a freeloader, a dependent, someone easily discarded. The financial pressure mounted. Lawyers are not cheap. My salary as a freelance graphic designer, while comfortable enough before, was no match for the resources Mark, a senior executive at a tech firm, could command. He knew this. He was leveraging his financial power, trying to bleed me dry, to force me to capitulate. The house itself became a battleground. Though no locks were changed yet, that would come later, Ms. Albright assured me. If the eviction somehow proceeded, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside the window, sounded like an approaching threat. I started to feel like an intruder in my own home. His few remaining possessions, some books he hadn't packed, a forgotten jacket in the closet, seemed to accuse me, to assert his claim. His confidence, relayed through his lawyer's arrogant pronouncements, was galling. He clearly believed he held all the cards, that he could simply erase me from the equation, take the house, and move on with his life, leaving me to pick up the shattered pieces. The man who once whispered words of love in the dark now wielded legal documents like weapons, intent on my utter defeat. The fight was no longer just about a house. It was about my dignity, my history, my very right to exist in the life I had helped build. And he seemed determined to strip me of all of it. I was drowning in legal jargon I barely understood, in letters from Mark's lawyer that dripped with condescension and veiled threats, in a sea of bills that seemed to multiply overnight. The weight of his betrayal, of the impending loss of my home, of my future, was a physical pressure on my chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. There were days I'd just sit on the living room floor, surrounded by the ghosts of happier times, and weep until I was empty, exhausted. Giving up seemed like the only sane option. Let him have the house, let him have everything, if it would just stop the pain, stop the relentless assault. Then, one particularly bleak afternoon, as I was sorting through old boxes in the attic, a desperate, futile attempt to find some misplaced document Ms. Albright had asked for, or maybe just to feel some semblance of control over something, anything, I stumbled upon a small, cedar chest. It was filled with my father's things, keepsakes he'd given me over the years. Old photographs, his service medals, a collection of badly tied fishing lures. My father. He'd passed away 5 years ago, a kind, gentle man with a quiet strength and an unshakable belief in doing the right thing. As I held a faded photo of him, a younger version, beaming proudly beside a ridiculously large fish, a memory surfaced. It was faint at first, like a dream half recalled. It was from around the time Mark and I were looking to buy this house. We were struggling with the down payment. My father, a retired contractor, wasn't wealthy, but he was comfortable. He'd offered to help. I remembered a conversation, him sitting at our tiny apartment kitchen table, me stressing about the finances, Mark unusually quiet. Dad had patted my hand. "Don't you worry your pretty little head about the money for this house, sweetheart," he'd said, his voice warm and reassuring. "I'll make some arrangements. It'll be my investment in your happiness. Just a little something to make sure you're always secure." Then he'd added, almost as an afterthought, something about paperwork, about keeping things tidy and protected. Always good to have things clear, just in case. At the time, I dismissed it as him being overly cautious, a father wanting to protect his daughter. Mark had handled most of the financial discussions with Dad directly back then, something about men talking numbers. I'd been caught up in the excitement of finally getting our dream house, too naive, too trusting to delve into the specifics of how Dad was arranging things. I just knew he'd helped, significantly. Could it be? Could there be something in what Dad had said, in how he'd structured his help, that could offer a lifeline now? It was a sliver of a hope, so fragile I was almost afraid to breathe on it. My hands trembled as I picked up my phone. I needed to talk to someone who might remember the details of Dad's finances, his legal dealings. His old lawyer, Mr. Henderson, a contemporary of my father's, now semi-retired but still sharp as a tack. It took a few calls to track him down at his small cottage by the lake. When I finally got him on the line, his voice was gravelly but kind. I explained my situation, the divorce, the eviction, the brutal tactics Mark was employing. I told him about the vague memory of my father's words, his talk of arrangements and protection concerning the house. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint crackle of a fireplace. Then Mr. Henderson cleared his throat. "Sarah, your father was a very wise man, and a very loving one. He always wanted to ensure you were taken care of, no matter what. He did indeed make certain provisions when he helped you and Mark with that house. Very specific provisions." My heart leaped. "What provisions, Mr. Henderson? What did he do?" "He didn't just give you money for a down payment, Sarah," Mr. Henderson said slowly, his voice gathering a certain gravity. "Your father, well, let me put it this way. He believed in solid foundations. In every sense. I think I have some files here. It might take me a day or two to locate the relevant documents. They're archived, you see. But don't you say a word to anyone yet. Especially not to your husband or his legal eagles. Let's see what we find first. Your father was meticulous. Mark might be in for a surprise."
À surprise.
The word hung in the air, electric with possibility. For the first time in weeks, a tiny spark ignited in the cold, dark pit of my stomach. It wasn't a blazing fire of hope, not yet, but it was something. A flicker. My father, even from beyond, might still be looking out for me. I wouldn't tell Ms. Albright yet, not until Mr. Henderson confirmed what he suspected. This information, if it was what I prayed it might be, was an ace up my sleeve. And I resolved, with a sudden surge of cold determination, to keep it hidden, to let Mark continue his arrogant advance, to let him believe he was winning. The deeper he waded into his deceit, the more satisfying it would be to watch him realize he was actually drowning. Mark, emboldened by my silence and what he clearly perceived as my crumbling defense, escalated his campaign of misery. He was a man possessed, driven by a vindictiveness I couldn't fathom. It was as if he needed to not just defeat me, but to utterly annihilate me. Whispers started to circulate among our mutual acquaintances, insidious little rumors painting me as unstable, grasping, even a little unhinged. I'd hear snippets trudge-hand. Sarah's not taking the divorce well. Sarah's making unreasonable demands. Sarah's always been a bit dramatic. It was a subtle character assassination designed to isolate me, to discredit me before I could even properly defend myself. His lawyer's letters became more frequent, more aggressive, filled with deadlines I couldn't possibly meet and demands that were financially crippling. He knew I loved the garden. One Saturday morning, I woke to the sound of a chainsaw. My blood ran cold. I rushed to the window to see a team of landscapers Mark had hired systematically cutting down the mature lilac bushes that bordered the property line, bushes I'd lovingly pruned and tended for years. They offered shade, privacy, and in the spring, a glorious burst of fragrant purple. When I ran out, frantic, demanding they stop, the foreman just shrugged and showed me a work order signed by Mark. "He's the owner, ma'am. We just do what we're told, the owner." The word was a slap in the face. My protests were useless. I stood there, helpless, as they reduced years of growth to a pile of mangled branches. It was a calculated act of cruelty, a message. Nothing you care about is safe from me. Then came the petty torments, the death by 1,000 cuts. The Netflix password was changed. The joint bank account, which held a small amount for household expenses, was suddenly emptied, with a curt email from his lawyer stating that all shared finances were now under review. He even had the internet service, which was in his name, disconnected, citing unnecessary shared expenditure. I was left scrambling to set up my own accounts, my own services. Each inconvenience a fresh reminder of his power and my precarious situation. The house, once a sanctuary, began to feel like a prison, cold and increasingly hostile. I started to document everything, every letter, every action, every small cruelty, a grim diary of my descent. The financial strain was immense. Ms. Albright was doing her best, filing countermotions, challenging his claims. But legal battles are wars of attrition, and Mark had deeper pockets. I was forced to dip into my meager savings, then into my small retirement fund, just to keep her on retainer. The fear of actual homelessness, once a distant, abstract horror, began to feel terrifyingly real. I started researching emergency shelters just in case. The shame of it burned. One evening, the ultimate blow. I was in the kitchen, listlessly stirring a pot of soup. My appetite had all but vanished when I saw headlights sweep across the driveway. A sleek, unfamiliar sports car pulled up. Mark got out. And then, from the passenger side, a woman emerged. Young, blonde, laughing as he took her arm. She was wearing a dress that probably cost more than my monthly legal fees. They walked, not towards the front door, but around the side of the house, towards a patio, my patio, where the ghost of the lilacs still hung in the air. He had the gall to bring her here, to our home, while I was still living in it, fighting for it. He was flaunting his new life, his triumph, rubbing my face in my obsolescence. I watched from the darkened kitchen window, my body rigid with a fury so cold it was almost serene. They didn't see me. He unlocked the patio door. He still had keys, of course, and they disappeared inside, into the living room. I could hear the faint sound of music, of her laughter. It was the lowest point. Everything seemed lost. He was not just erasing me. He was replacing me, right before my eyes, in the very heart of what I still, foolishly, considered our space. I felt a despair so profound it was almost a physical collapse. He had won. He had taken everything. But as I stood there, watching the shadows move in my living room, the scene of my ultimate humiliation playing out just feet away, something inside me didn't break. It hardened. The grief, the despair, they didn't vanish, but they were suddenly overshadowed by a different emotion, something cold and sharp and diamond-hard. Anger. A pure, unadulterated rage that was surprisingly clarifying. This wasn't about love lost anymore, or saving a marriage, or even about fairness. This was about survival. This was about retribution. He thought he could parade his new life through the ruins of mine, in the very house he was trying to steal from me, and I would just crumble? He had underestimated me. He had mistaken my shock and sorrow for weakness. He had no idea what he had just unleashed. The image of my father's kind face, his words about protection and solid foundations, flashed into my mind. Mr. Henderson's voice, cautious but hopeful. Mark might be in for a surprise. The time for hoping, for waiting, for absorbing blows, was over. The next morning, my resolve was like steel. I didn't call Ms. Albright first. I called Mr. Henderson. Mr. Henderson, I said, my voice devoid of the tremor it had held just days before. It's Sarah Clark. I need those files. I need whatever my father put in place. Mark crossed a line last night. He brought her here, to the house. There was a brief silence, then Mr. Henderson's voice, grim now. The arrogance of that man. Sarah, I found them. Your father was, as I said, meticulous. And he loved you very, very much. What he did, it's quite definitive. What is it? I asked, my heart pounding, but my hand steady on the phone. Your father didn't just help with the down payment, Sarah. He bought the property.
Outright.
The deed, the title, it's solely in his name. He set up a trust, with you as the sole lifetime beneficiary of that trust, granting you exclusive right of residence for as long as you live, regardless of marital status or any other consideration. You are, for all intents and purposes, the only person with a legal right to occupy that house. Mark is, at best, a guest. At worst, now a trespasser. The air left my lungs in a silent whoosh. My father owned the entire property, and I had a lifetime lease. All Mark's claims about his contributions, his name on mortgage documents, which must have been for subsequent loans or lines of credit, not the original purchase, his assertions of ownership, they were built on sand. Worse, they were built on a lie, or at least a monumental, arrogant assumption. And Mr. Henderson continued, his voice taking on a steely edge that reminded me so much of my dad. There's more. Your father, anticipating perhaps that life doesn't always go as planned, included a clause. Any attempt by any party to fraudulently claim ownership or try to dispossess the beneficiary you from the property would trigger certain penalties. And he kept meticulous records of every penny he put into that house, not just the purchase, but significant contributions to its upkeep and improvements over the years, all documented as investments into his asset, an asset held in trust for you. A slow smile spread across my face. It wasn't a happy smile. It was a grim, satisfied smile. The kind of smile that promised a reckoning. Mr. Henderson, I said, I need copies of everything. Immediately. And I need to speak with Ms. Albright. It's time to stop playing defense. It's time to show Mark what he's really up against. The fight was no longer about saving what was. It was about claiming what was rightfully mine and making Mark pay for every sleepless night, every whispered insult, every calculated cruelty. He wanted a war? He was about to get one he never saw coming. The hunted was about to become the hunter. And I had the perfect ammunition, lovingly prepared years ago by a father who saw further than I ever could. The courtroom was exactly as I'd imagined, imposing, sterile, and smelling faintly of floor polish and old paper. The dark wood paneling seemed to absorb sound, creating a heavy, expectant silence. Mark sat at the plaintiff's table with his lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Peterson whose smug expression had been a constant source of irritation in his correspondence. Mark himself looked confident, almost bored, occasionally glancing at his expensive watch as if this whole proceeding was a minor inconvenience he'd soon dispense with. He caught my eye once, a flicker of something, disdain? Triumph? Before turning back to confer with Peterson in a low murmur. He had no idea. Ms. Albright, beside me, was the picture of calm professionalism, but I could feel a tightly coiled energy radiating from her. We had spent the last week meticulously preparing, armed with the bombshell documents Mr. Henderson had couriered over. The original deed of trust, pristine and undeniable, bearing my father's sole name. The trust agreement, equally ironclad, naming me as lifetime beneficiary with exclusive residency. And a carefully compiled ledger of my father's investments into the property, dwarfing any contribution Mark could claim. Peterson stood first, his voice smooth and practiced, laying out Mark's case for the eviction. He spoke of Mark's significant financial contributions, his primary role in acquiring and maintaining the marital home, painting a picture of Mark as the aggrieved party, burdened by an uncooperative spouse occupying his valuable asset. He presented bank statements, receipts for renovations, many of which I now knew had been funded by my father, not Mark, and even a selectively edited email exchange where I'd supposedly acknowledged Mark's ownership. It was a masterclass in misdirection and half-truths. Mark nodded along, a look of solemn agreement on his face. He actually looked like he believed his own fiction. The audacity was stunning. I felt a tremor of anger, but Ms. Albright's hand rested briefly on my arm, a silent command to remain calm. Our turn would come. Finally, Peterson concluded his presentation with a flourish. Your Honor, it is clear that Mr. Clark has the predominant financial and equitable interest in this property. Ms. Clark's continued occupancy is not only preventing him from accessing his rightful asset, but is also causing him considerable financial and emotional distress. We respectfully request the court grant the eviction order. The judge, a woman with a weary but astute expression, made some notes, and then looked towards our table. Ms. Albright? Ms. Albright rose gracefully. Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Peterson has painted a compelling, if somewhat imaginative, picture. However, we believe a few crucial pieces of documentation might provide some necessary clarity. She approached the bench and handed a set of documents to the clerk, who passed them to the judge. Another set was delivered to Peterson, who accepted it with a dismissive air, as if expecting more of the same delaying tactics he'd accused us of. Your Honor, Ms. Albright continued, her voice clear and steady, we present Exhibit A, the original, certified deed of trust for the property located at 123 Willow Creek Lane, dated October 17, 22 years ago. As you will see, the sole grantee listed on this deed is Mr. Arthur Davies. She paused, letting the name sink in. Mr. Arthur Davies is my client's deceased father. I watched Mark's face. He frowned slightly, a look of mild confusion. Peterson, however, had started to flip through the documents, his dismissive air evaporating, replaced by a flicker of something else. Furthermore, Your Honor, Ms. Albright pressed on, we present Exhibit B, the Arthur Davies Living Trust Agreement, also dated October 17, 22 years ago. This irrevocable trust names Mr. Davies' daughter, Ms. Sarah Clark, my client, as the sole lifetime beneficiary, granting her exclusive and unimpeded right of residence in the aforementioned property for the duration of her natural life, irrespective of marital status or any other subsequent claims. This right predates her marriage to Mr. Clark by several years. The silence in the courtroom was no longer just heavy, it was deafening. I could hear the rustle of paper as the judge examined the deed, then the trust. Peterson's face had gone from confused to alarmed. He was rapidly shuffling through his copies, his smugness completely gone. Mark, however, still didn't seem to grasp the full implication. He leaned over to Peterson, whispering something, a frustrated look on his face. He probably thought it was some minor technicality his lawyer could easily sweat away. Ms. Albright let the silence stretch for a moment before delivering the final, quiet blow. Therefore, Your Honor, it is our contention that Mr. Clark has no legal standing to evict Ms. Clark from a property he does not and has never owned. In fact, any claim he has made to ownership in these proceedings or in the concurrent divorce filings would appear to be mistaken at best. The judge looked up from the documents, her gaze sharp, first at Ms. Albright, then at a now visibly pale Peterson, and finally at Mark. Mark was staring at his lawyer, his mouth slightly agape, a look of dawning horror spreading across his features. The confident smirk that had been plastered on his face all morning had vanished, replaced by a ghastly, sickly pallor. His carefully constructed world, his arrogant assumptions, his entire strategy had just been demolished by a few pieces of paper, by the foresight of a man he had likely dismissed as an easy mark years ago. He looked like he'd been physically struck. The swagger, the entitlement, the sheer, unadulterated arrogance, all gone, leaving behind a raw, stunned disbelief. He finally understood. He hadn't just lost his eviction attempt. He had lost everything. But Ms. Albright wasn't finished. Oh no, She was just getting warmed up. The air in the courtroom crackled. Mark was still reeling, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning panic. Peterson, his lawyer, looked like he'd swallowed a wasp, shuffling papers with frantic, useless energy. Furthermore, Your Honor, Ms. Albright continued, her voice maintaining that calm, lethal precision, given Mr. Clark's demonstrable misrepresentations regarding ownership of the property at 123 Willow Creek Lane throughout these proceedings and in his initial divorce filings where he listed said property as a primary marital asset to be divided in his favor. We will be formally petitioning for sanctions against Mr. Clark for attempting to mislead this court and for fraudulent claims. Mark's head snapped up.
Sanction?
Fraudulent claims? The color, what little had returned to his face, drained away again. He looked from Ms. Albright to the judge, a wild, cornered look in his eyes. Additionally, Ms. Albright pressed on, relentless, as the legal, lifetime tenant with exclusive right of residence, my client, Ms. Clark, will be filing a countersuit against Mr. Clark for harassment, emotional distress, and pecuniary damages incurred as a result of this baseless and malicious eviction attempt. This includes all legal fees Ms. Clark has been forced to expend defending her rightful home and compensation for the deliberate destruction of property, specifically the mature lilac bushes Mr. Clark had removed without lawful authority. She glanced pointedly at Mark, whose jaw seemed to be slowly unhinging. The judge was listening intently, her expression unreadable but stern. Then, Ms. Albright delivered the final, devastating blow, the one that would turn Mark's world completely upside down. And one final matter, Your Honor. Mr. Arthur Davies, the late owner of the property, through the executor of his estate and trust, which, for clarity, is Mr. Henderson, his long-standing legal counsel, has instructed us to formally inform Mr. Mark Clark that, as he has no legal right to reside at 123 Willow Creek Lane, and has in fact been occupying the premises under false pretenses since his separation from Ms. Clark and his subsequent hostile actions, he is now considered to be trespassing. She paused, letting that word hang in the air.
Trespassing.
Mr. Clark will be served with a formal notice to vacate the premises immediately. He will have 24 hours from receipt of that notice to remove all his personal belongings. Any items remaining after that period will be considered abandoned. Should he fail to comply, the trust will pursue all available legal remedies to have him removed. Mark's jaw didn't just unhinge. It looked like it hit the polished courtroom floor. His eyes, wide with shock and utter incomprehension, darted from Ms. Albright to me, then back to his own lawyer, who seemed to be shrinking in his chair. The man who had confidently tried to render me homeless was now facing his own eviction, on the most humiliating terms imaginable. The hunter had not only become the hunted, he was about to be skinned and displayed as a warning. All his elaborate plans, his arrogant assumptions about the house being his to take, his to leverage in the divorce, all of it had spectacularly backfired. His supposed contributions to the property? They weren't investments in his asset. At best, they were contributions to the upkeep of a home he lived in, or gifts to me, or perhaps, if the trust chose to pursue it, unpaid rent. His attempt to claim the house in the divorce was now not just moot, but potentially a source of further legal trouble for him. He had overplayed his hand so spectacularly, based on a foundation of lies and greed, that he hadn't just lost, he'd engineered his own ruin. He hadn't just pointed a gun at me, he'd somehow managed to turn it, load it with his own deceptions, and fire it directly into his own foot, if not his chest. The silence that followed Ms. Albright's final statement was profound, broken only by Mark's ragged, audible gasp for air. He looked utterly, completely, and satisfyingly blindsided. The days that followed were a blur, but a strangely peaceful one. The silence in the house was different now. It wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence of impending doom or the echoing silence of Mark's absence after he first left. It was a clean silence, a quiet hum of possibility. It was the sound of peace settling back into the rooms, chasing out the ghosts of conflict and betrayal. Mark, true to the court's implicit directive and the explicit notice from my father's trust, was gone within 24 hours. He didn't try to fight it, he couldn't. He sent movers, a grim-faced, efficient crew who packed his remaining belongings with a speed that spoke of urgency and shame. I stayed in the upstairs bedroom, listening to the sounds of his life being boxed up and removed from mine. There was no triumph in that moment, just a quiet sense of an ending, a necessary amputation. I didn't watch him leave. I didn't need to. The house felt lighter, as if it, too, could finally breathe again. The garden, even with the gaping wound where the lilacs had been, seemed to sigh in relief. I walked through the rooms, touching the familiar furniture, the worn surfaces. It was mine. Truly, unequivocally mine, protected by a father's love and foresight that reached across the years. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a fortress, my sanctuary, a testament not to a failed marriage, but to enduring love of a different, more steadfast kind. The divorce proceedings continued, of course, but the entire landscape had shifted. Mark's leverage was gone. His claims on the property were dismissed. His attempts to paint me as grasping or unreasonable now looked ridiculous in light of his own deceptions. The financial tables had turned. With the threat of sanctions and the countersuit for damages looming, his lawyer, a humbled and much less smug Mr. Peterson, became surprisingly eager to negotiate a settlement, one that was far more favorable to me than I could have ever dreamed just weeks before. Mark had tried to break me, to take everything. Instead, his greed and arrogance had cost him dearly, not just financially, but in reputation and, I hoped, in some measure of self-awareness, though that might be too much to ask. There were still moments of sadness, of course. 15 years of shared life don't just vanish without a trace. There were memories, good ones, that would sometimes surface unbidden, tinged with the bittersweet knowledge of what had been lost, what had been thrown away by his choices. But the sharp edges of betrayal were slowly softening, replaced by a growing sense of my own strength, a resilience I never knew I possessed until I was forced to find it. I learned that trust, once shattered, is a difficult thing to rebuild, not just in others, but in one's own judgment. But I also learned that even in the darkest of times, there can be unexpected allies, unforeseen strengths, and that sometimes the greatest protections are forged in love, long before the battles ever begin. My father had given me more than a house. He had given me a foundation, a safe harbor, reminder that I was and always would be cherished and protected. The house stood, solid and reassuring, a symbol of survival and of a future I could now shape on my own terms. This house has seen tears of joy, then the bitter sting of betrayal, and now, quiet strength, a resilient peace. It's heard laughter, then threats, and now, the sound of my own steady breathing. If this story found a chord in you, if it echoed any of your own battles fought and won, or struggles you're facing now, I'd love to hear your version. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is. Your stories remind me, and everyone reading, that we're not alone in these tangled human dramas. And please, if you haven't yet, subscribe. It helps bring more of these to life, more stories of resilience, and the unexpected turns of fate.